speed that the Dhamma has disappeared so quickly that they really have to recollect the Dhamma. So why was it felt that the council is needed so soon after the Buddha's passing away? And here you can imagine the monks being scattered all over the landscape, living in different parts of the middle Ganges Valley and even outside of that. So you can say scattered throughout India, especially these northern parts. And so the question is, what happened? What happened in the intermediate period between the Buddha's passing away and the first council? And it is recorded in our Vinaya texts that there were some monks, even though the Buddha had just passed away, and of course many monks were quite sad and concerned about that, and they feel the teacher has gone, even though the Buddha did encourage them, don't worry, the Dhamma will be your teacher when I'm gone. But of course, it's not the same as having the Buddha around in his full life and energy, and inspiring not only by his words but also by his actions. However, there were also some monks even who were quite happy that the Buddha had passed on. They said things like, well, actually, I think we are better off now that the Buddha is gone. He used to give us all these rules and regulations, and now we can do as we wish. The teacher is gone, so now all these rules we don't have to follow anymore. So when Mahakassapa, the foremost in ascetic practices, and also very elder monk at that time already, when he heard about these rumors that particularly one monk is going around and saying, oh, it's great actually that the Buddha had passed away, we are better off without him. Of course he was quite concerned when he heard that. Because if that sentiment, if that perspective, that view spreads within the community, monastic and lay community, the sasana is not going to last for a long time. So therefore, he quickly spread the word and shared the information and requested and made the initiative to conduct a council as fast as possible, to assemble the monks together, to meet, and also discuss some of the important points that were a bit open questions at that time. And one of the important questions that was hanging in the air, which was one statement that the Buddha made just recently, just before his awakening. At that time, he said to the monks, if the monks wish, if the monks please, they may, if they want, the Sangha can, if it wants, abolish the smaller and minor rules. The smaller and minor rules, if the Sangha wants, they can put those aside. But unfortunately, he didn't say which are the smaller and minor rules. So there was a bit of a controversy, different opinions about that. So that was also something that needed to be resolved, isn't it? The Buddha gives this invitation, this allowance, but then what are we going to do with that? Because if every monk comes up with his own interpretation or with his own set of rules, these are the smaller ones, these are not, there will be no harmony in the Sangha. And they can't even do the Patimokkha together anymore, because everybody has different standards. So for that reason too, Venerable Mahakassapa thought it would be important if the Sangha comes together at a place like this and to discuss those important matters. So a couple of weeks later, they held this meeting then, up here. It was supposedly at the beginning of the rainy season. And then also for this special meeting, in order to partake and participate, you can see the area is not so large. So they had only limited space here. So they said only 500 participants max, approx, as our tour guide would say. 500 max. No, not more, not less. So at that time, as the story goes, Venerable Ananda himself, he's the one who remembers the Buddha's teachings the best. He had this amazing memory. He could just recite many of those teachings, or seemingly all of them, by heart. And it seems no other monk was as skilled in recitation as he was, because he was living with the Buddha all the time. And even if there was maybe a lapse of memory, he could just ask the Buddha, how did you mean this? How was that? So it was quite important actually for him to be there as somebody who understands and knows and memorizes the Dhamma very well, as well as Venerable Upali. Not Upali Dhammika, but the ancient Upali. Maybe nowadays Upali might also be invited, we don't know. But the ancient Upali was important because he was an expert in the discipline, in the Vinaya. So, Ananda was the expert on the Dhamma, Upali was the expert in the Vinaya. So, these two were supposed to participate. But in order to limit the participation to, as you see, the place is quite limited in space. So, they laid down the regulation, only Arahants are allowed to join this Sangha meeting. Arahants who have both heard the Dhamma, learned the Dhamma, but also practiced it to its completion. So if you want to come up here and enter this area, you have to show your VIP pass, the Arahant VIP pass. Only then you were allowed to participate in this special meeting. But there was just one problem. Venerable Ananda. Venerable Ananda at that time was actually only a stream enterer. He was not an Arahant yet. So it's kind of a surprise also, isn't it? Ananda is staying with the Buddha for so many years, listening to the Dhamma, can ask for instructions all the time. Yet, he was only a stream enterer. So you can see that just being next to the Buddha and hearing the word directly from him is no guarantee for higher attainments. And it's maybe good to remember because some monks or devotees also say, if I could just hear the word from the Buddha, it would be so easy. Not necessarily so, In fact, nowadays, if you read the words of the Buddha or listen to them, you hear more or less the same as ancient monks and nuns and devotees have heard. Most of it will not have changed significantly. And there's no guarantee just by hearing it from the Buddha. Not everyone became an Arahant just because they heard it from the Buddha. So Venerable Ananda, who would have been quite important to join the meeting here to recite the Dhamma, he was only a stream enterer. And once he heard about the requirement, only Arahants allowed to participate, that was a motivation for him to strive and practice even further. So he meditated night and day, but not much came out of it. So the days are passing, and he still was only a Sotapanna. And the story goes that just on the night before the meeting started, that was the night where he practiced with all his effort. Nothing. And then as it was quite late already, in the late hours, early morning hours, he was ready, give up, take a rest, lying down. And the anecdote is, as he was lying down, just about to lie down, the head not yet touching the pillow, but the feet already in the air, at that time, he became an Arahant. So you see, any posture goes. Not just sitting, walking, standing or lying down, even hanging in the air while falling asleep or lying down. Even that can be a moment of awakening. And also I find it interesting, also the significance. His mind has kind of surrendered by that time, I imagine. Because he was striving so hard. And then finally he let go. He gave up. He said, I did my best. And that's when it happened. So it's also a small little lesson maybe packaged in that. Yes, the striving was important, of course, but then also the element of letting go. Say, all right, I did what I could do. And that's when he became an Arahant. And finally he qualified in this way for participation in the meeting on the next morning. So then they did come together, gathering here, everybody showing his VIP pass. And then, the meeting started, and Venerable Ananda would recite the discourses, and Venerable Upali would answer questions and recite the Vinaya, the legal texts. However, before it came to that, as I said in the beginning, there was one important point that was hanging in the air, which was the Buddha's invitation for the monks to abolish the smaller and minor rules, right? So, if you have smaller and minor rules, it also means there are probably some also that are heavy or strong, important ones. So they were discussing. And then some said, the 4 parajika rules, these surely have to be important, major rules. But then what is below that, like we have 6 different categories. What is below that, actually 7, that are the smaller and minor rules. So, okay, sounds reasonable. But then, for example, accepting money is actually not a parajika rule. At the same time, it seems something quite serious, isn't it? Or for monks or nuns to have very close relationship either with each other or with the opposite gender, that also seems quite inappropriate. Even though if it does not come to sexual intercourse, but very flirtatious behavior or even touching each other, that seems also not very appropriate. Yet, it's not a parajika offense. So then some said, no, parajika and sanghadisesa rules, these 2 are the heavy. And everything below that, these are the smaller and minor rules. Okay. But then as I said earlier, how about money rule? Money rule is neither parajika nor sanghadisesa. It's just a pachitya offense. Then some said, well, that's such an important thing. The Buddha has repeatedly spoken out about who has money, who handles money. To him, the doors of sense pleasures are wide open. What does that mean? Why are the doors to sense pleasures open? Because one has money. Any idea? How does that work? Well, you have some money with you. Yeah, you go down the hill, you see something nice. You want to go for eating, today Mexican, tomorrow Japanese, and then Italian. Yeah, you can do that, right? But as a samana, normally we can't do that. Whatever people give us, that's what we eat. So sense pleasures, yeah, you can just buy whatever you like. So you're not accountable to anyone. So the Buddha said, spoke out quite often against that, for monastics of course. So then some said, no, actually, parajika and sanghadisesa and pachitya rules, these are the heavy ones, more serious ones, and then everything below that, well actually there's not so much below anymore, but then there are still some categories below. So in this way they were arguing back and forth and couldn't really reach a consensus. Until one monk remembered, you know what, was this incident where somebody from quite far came to see the Buddha, and the Buddha was actually on retreat at the time, on a meditation retreat for the whole Vasa, and they actually didn't want to be disturbed. So he said to people, to the other monks, please make sure that nobody comes to visit me. I want to stay by myself for these 3 months. And so they did. And they even laid down an extra rule that whoever goes to see the Buddha commits a Vinaya offense, a pachitya offense. So time goes by, nobody comes. Eventually somebody came on a very urgent matter to visit the Buddha. And they tell him, no, you cannot go to see the Buddha. He said, yeah, I really want to see him. He said, no, you don't go in. He doesn't want to see anyone. By the way, it's a pachitya offense to see the Buddha. He said, well, I don't care. I want to see the Buddha. So he went ahead nonetheless. So he went to see the Buddha and discussed some matters with him. And at the end of the conversation, that happened already much earlier, not before the Buddha's passing away. And at the end of the conversation, he paid his respects, and as he was about to leave, the Buddha asks him, are you aware that actually you're not supposed to visit me right now? And are you aware that they have laid down a Vinaya offense for that? The monk said, yes, Bhante, I'm aware of that. But my practice is, I practice how the Buddha was teaching the Dhamma. And the rules that the Buddha has laid down, those he accepts, but those that were not yet laid down by the Buddha, he's not adding, and he doesn't feel bound by that Sangha regulation that these monks made by adding new rules that the Buddha never laid down. What did the Buddha say? He said, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. The Buddha praised him. He said, oh, very good, excellent. He praised him for that. So this is one incident, and there was another one on another occasion, where the Buddha explicitly said, monks, you should train yourselves, not adding new rules to those who I have laid down already, and by also not removing the already existing ones. Remember yesterday when we were on Gaya's Head, on Mount Varcha Peak, we spoke about the principles of cordiality. One of them was the same. It says the same principle. Community comes to growth, to non-decline, as long as they do not abolish the rules and agreements that have been made, and do not add new ones. In that sutta also, the Buddha says, this is one of the principles of non-decline. So of course, these 500 arahants remembered all these teachings of the Buddha, and they said, well, we don't know what are the small and minor rules, but clearly the Buddha might not have been in favor even. Who knows he was in favor or not? Maybe he just wanted to give us the opportunity. Some even say maybe it was a test. I don't know. So, but remember the principle that the Buddha himself approved of. Not adding new rules, but also not removing the existing ones. And that's exactly what they agreed upon. So they said, never mind what are the small and minor rules that the Buddha may have had in mind, and we will just practice accordingly, not adding new ones, not removing the existing ones. And that was agreed upon by 500 arahants. Yeah. So that's actually also quite an interesting teaching that we have to keep in mind, even nowadays. Because nowadays also, every now and then you will maybe hear or find a monk who says, these are just small rules, they're not so relevant. Or the Buddha already allowed us to abolish the smaller rules. Yes, he did, but there was already a Sangha meeting held on this very topic. In fact, we have a separate regulation that says we are not allowed to reopen a legal case that has already been properly dealt with before. A new topic, yes, we can bring up, but something that the Sangha has already held a meeting on and agreed upon, you cannot just bring it up again and again until the outcome is what you want, right? So it's not possible to reopen the same case again. And to be honest, the first council, the meeting, the participants, who were they? 500 arahants. Who dares to override the wisdom and discernment of 500 arahants who lived with the Buddha at the Buddha's time? If anybody knows what the Buddha might have had in mind with this statement, it should have been them. And whatever they have decided, I think we're in quite good hands. So there's no need nowadays to override them, their earlier agreement. It's considered case closed, actually, in the Theravada tradition. Yes, in other traditions they did go steps further and may have abolished certain rules, but in the early Buddhist tradition we regard that as binding, the first council. And also important to keep in mind, the Buddha said the Sangha may abolish the rules, not individual monks. It's not that I can decide, I don't like this rule, I abolish that for me. Another one comes along and says, I abolish these rules. Then there will be no harmony in the community, right? And also very confusing for the devotees. You invite the monks for dana, and everybody has different standards, and everybody says, you have to offer the food like this, like that. Partly we already find that even nowadays. Not because the rules have been abandoned, but because different interpretations of the existing rules have also developed over time. So to avoid all that confusion, or at least to limit them to a bare minimum, the Theravada tradition is quite strong actually, and still upholds that sentiment. Not adding new rules, but also not removing the existing ones. Even if they seem a bit outdated maybe these days, some of them. But if they were good enough for the Arahants at that time, surely they will also be good enough for us, right? If it worked for Sariputta, Mahamoggallana, Anuruddha, and so on, it can't be unwholesome for us nowadays to follow in the same principles. So that's how we hold it. And that's also very much the principle up in SPS, how we practice. We're not trying to identify which rules are early, which are late, or which make sense to us, which don't make sense to us, Westerners, 21st generation or 21st century. What we nowadays regard as makes sense might not have been what made sense to people in ancient India, and vice versa. So therefore, as a sign of humility and trust, we trust the discernment of the Arahants of the ancient times. So this is what the Arahants agreed upon here at this very memorable place. And then at the end, to close the meeting off in harmony, they were reciting the Dhamma and the Vinaya together. So many of them could memorize, and those who could not memorize everything, they would just listen for a while and then tune in again what they could memorize. And then Venerable Ananda was leading the Dhamma recitation, and Venerable Upari, the Vinaya part of it. So then, how about the Abhidhamma texts? Yeah. Abhidhamma also quite, how many books? 8 books. 8 books of the Abhidhamma. 7? 8. So, some have questioned a little bit whether at the first council, whether it's really realistic that we assume that the Abhidhamma texts were already part of the, what we nowadays call the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets. Because it's actually quite a lot of text. And if you can try to read just one book after another, you might not be finished, not even within half a year, not to speak of 6 months. And also you might have to go to the toilet from time to time and eat something. So some have questioned the amount of text that we find in the canonical Abhidhamma, together with its commentaries especially, and sub-commentaries. But even just the canonical part is so much, has grown over the centuries, it seems, from a historical perspective, that it's rather likely, most scholars would say it's very unlikely, that the Abhidhamma was already recited at the first council. But it was still early, the canonical Abhidhamma, so that latest by the third council, which was when? When was this third council? About 200 or 300 years after the Buddha's passing away. By that time, the Abhidhamma was definitely, the canonical Abhidhamma was already in existence and got enshrined at that time. We know that because after that, the Theravada canon was considered closed. No more books to be added. So by the time of the third council, the early version of the Abhidhamma was already in existence. We're not speaking about Abhidhamma Sangaha or Visuddhimagga. These of course came later. But the canonical Abhidhamma books were closed and were already finalized at that time. Okay? So there's a bit of a historical perspective of this very important place here that we find here. And yeah, it feels like, something very significant has happened here. And if this meeting, that council would not have happened, who knows what would have happened to the sasana? Because the Buddha did mention one reason why the teachings or the sasana of some Buddhas, of previous Buddhas, did not last long, did not last for thousands of years. One reason for that, actually not one, their reason for that is that they did not lay down the Vinaya rules. They didn't give detailed boundaries in terms of conduct for the Sangha. So the nuns were naturally well behaved in the early phases of their sasana, but then of course everything is impermanent, changes and declines, and without the legal framework of the Vinaya, things fall apart much quicker compared to having those boundaries. So for the longevity of the sasana, the Buddha did then, our Buddha, or Sammasambuddha Gautama, he did lay down the Vinaya rules, and therefore his sasana lasted much longer. And is still in existence, we can say, right? Otherwise we wouldn't be here. So it's an important pillar for the sasana, and what has happened here, this meeting with the 500 arahants, laid the foundation so that even 2,500 years later, we still can come to a place like this, we still know about the Buddha's teachings, and can practice meditation, and still attain noble paths and fruits. Because that's what it's ultimately all about. So it's not just that we maintain the scriptures for a long time, or have something to put on our bookshelves. No, it's something that we can put into practice, into our hearts, and also follow in this way the footsteps of the Buddha. So I would say we take in that special moment here, we can close our eyes and just meditate a little bit on the significance of this place, of its history, as well as the generosity of King Ajatasattu, who organized and coordinated this first council, who made sure that there was food being offered, medicine if someone got sick, diarrhea, vomiting, whatever, shelter, light, whatever was needed. And then of course the eminent Arahant monks and nuns. As far as I recall, it was actually mostly monks. According to the Vinaya text, it was 500 bhikkhus. Who made the wise choice with great foresight, a very conservative choice, out of compassion, wisdom, prudence. To practice the Buddha's teachings as he has formulated them, without adding things, without removing things. on this occasion, we can also remember the countless generations of monks and nuns who made tremendous efforts to pass on these teachings from one to another. In the early stages, this transmission was done orally, through recitation, through memorization. Where the teacher would sit together with his students and teach line by line. So that the accuracy of the teachings are maintained. It's not just like the retelling of a story that one has heard in one's own words. No, it's the verbatim, literal memorization of standardized texts. So you can imagine the effort and the time that has been invested to that end. So that the purity of the Buddha's teachings can be maintained and has been maintained for many generations. Can have a heart of gratitude for this immense sacrifice of time, effort, consistency, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of future generations yet to come. None of us would be here today if it were not for those generations of monks and nuns, and sometimes even lay devotees. But mostly at that time it was the job of the monks and nuns who committed their lives to the study and practice of the Dhamma. And it was only 100 years before the Common Era, at the Fourth Council in Sri Lanka, that the Dhamma was for the first time written down. But for the first 400 years, it was memorized and passed on orally. With much gratitude to everyone involved in that. So that we nowadays, 2,500, almost 2,600 years later, can still benefit from those invaluable teachings. They would be proud. They would be happy if they could see us nowadays here, still upholding the Buddha's teachings, practicing virtue, samadhi, efforts were not in vain. If, and only if we put the Buddha's teachings to good use. This is the way how we honor not only the Buddha, but also the efforts of all those monks and nuns who have maintained the Buddha's teachings, sometimes even at the risk of their own lives. When there were hostile kings who were not supportive. Or invasions. So that nowadays we can access the Dhamma so easily through reading or listening, both offline as well as online. All thanks to these early generations of people who have dedicated themselves to the memorization of these texts. With much gratitude, love and respect, let us say sadhu 3 times to their efforts. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And speaking of efforts, we will have to walk down again this hill, I realize. Not just walking up, but also walking down. But it's going to be easier, right? And then in the afternoon, we're going to Velavana, and then eventually making our way to Vaisali? Varanasi. Even the tour guide doesn't know where we are going. Too absorbed in the bliss of this place. So we can gradually, slowly, mindfully back up and then make our way down again. Sadhu.